God orders everything. He gets to the end and says, it's all good. It's all very good. But chaos is still there. In other words, God doesn't eliminate it. It's just under control. I don't want to rabbit trail on that too much, but we always wonder why is there evil? Why is there unpredictability in the world? And an Israelite would say, it's because God subdued it, controls it, and lets it exist. It is part of the creation. It's what he wanted. And he sustains it and controls it. Now, if he would remove his hand from it, which some prophecies say he's going to do at some point, then we have problems. As the first slide suggests, we're going to talk about Genesis and other creation accounts. Now, when I say other creation accounts, I, of course, mean other creation accounts that existed and were put forth by other civilizations in the ancient world, Israel's neighbors, okay, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, Babylonians, that sort of thing. But whether you realize it or not, there are actually creation account passages in the Old Testament that do not sound like Genesis 1. Okay, so you also have other creation accounts in the Bible itself. And so I want to sort of give you, as much as is possible in a limited amount of time, a feel for the ancient worldview that all of these creation cosmologies and cosmogonies had. Basically, those are two terms that refer to how everything got here and who made it and who ordered it, arranged it, all that sort of thing. And of course, Israel's view was that the God of Israel did that very naturally. And of course, the competitive views were some deity or a group of deities in their own pantheons were responsible. So there's competition, there's theological competition. There's a shared worldview. And I think when we see how a lot of the ideas are the same and overlap, when we get to the Israelite stuff, you're going to be able to see much more clearly why a writer is doing what he's doing and saying what he's saying, even though it's going to sound really strange at points. I want to try to give you the backdrop to be able to parse some of the things that are going on in passages, because if you just read them, they're going to sound really strange. But with the context, it'll start clicking in your mind, okay, I know exactly what he's shooting at here. I know why he's saying that, because of this idea and this competing theology next door. So with that said, we need to fix a few obvious things in our mind. Biblical creation accounts were written at different times by different people in different contexts with different goals than, of course, our own. And even with respect to each other, they had agendas. Agenda is not a bad word. They just had purpose in what they were doing. However, again, when it comes to biblical creation stories, even if they don't look the same on the surface, they do have one unified goal, and the goal is theological. It's not about giving us scientific method or scientific jargon or talking. It's about theologically being correct. Who created everything? Who's responsible? Who should get the credit? And who shouldn't? Right? Now, for Mesopotamia, some of you might have been exposed to some of this stuff. It's really quite strange. If you've ever read any sort of maybe a Pacific Northwest Indian account or a Native American creation story, or really anything outside the Bible, you get essentially battling deities, and you get really weird conceptual ideas. You get, divine animals doing this or that to each other and interacting with gods and goddesses and people. To our ear, it's really strange because, again, for the most part, you go to Genesis and it's like God just speaks and there it is. And you have an orderly succession. Part of the reason for this, and Mesopotamia is going to fit into the odd category, is that they're struggling with answering some fundamental questions. How did everything get here? And who put it there? And if we sort of know or state our belief in who put it there, well, how did they get here? Okay, now we ask the same questions, or we get the same questions asked of us. You know, we affirm that God's the creator, and somebody, you know, is going to ask, well, where did God come from? And we talk about self-existence, you know, that he always existed and so on and so forth. A lot of ancient civilizations didn't really have that idea. Everything had to come from something. But some of them sort of gave up and said, okay, in the very beginning, there was a deity or a group of deities. So that's one set of struggles. The other is they don't have any kind of scientific background or vocabulary like we do. But they live in the world. They can see that there's a relationship between living things. And in the ancient world, there was speculation on all this stuff that we see. It's probably made from just a few things. They would be called primal or primeval elements. And when I use the word element, I'm not talking about science like hydrogen, and, you know, nothing like that. They thought if you could reduce everything that we see into the basic things, what would it be? Now, maybe you might remember this from high school history or history of Civ or something like that. Some candidates for how an ancient person would parse this would be what? Everything is made up of, well, also if you're into 70s music, you could probably answer this question. Earth, wind, fire, and water is the fourth. Those were usually perceived as the four primal elements. Again, this isn't scientific at all, but everything else is probably made from one of those. In the case of Mesopotamia, what they did was they came up with the notion that there are actually two groups of gods. There are the gods who interacted with people. Those are the ones who show up in their stories. You know, the god or goddess did this or that. But before those gods, there were other gods, because the other older gods had to make the ones that we interact with, because they got to come from somewhere. So they actually had two groups. And the oldest group, they sort of deified, or they made the primary elemental stuff. They described things like earth, wind, fire, and water as though they were gods to start off the story. Because they had a sense that everything comes from somewhere, something that we experience, but they have no scientific knowledge, so they're not talking about chemistry, okay? But what they do figure is, you know, for all that stuff to get here, it had to be, you know, there had to be life force in it. And so they just characterized primary elements as though they were persons, gods and goddesses. Because what they're going to do is they're going to say the gods and the goddesses that represent these primal elements are going to get together. And often the description is a sexual one, but they're going to get together and then produce other things in the natural world and other deities that represent natural things. Again, this is completely pre-scientific. So, where does every living thing come from, the ancient Mesopotamia would ask? How do we get living things? Very normal answer. If you don't know any science, you say, well, living things come because of sex. Animals reproduce. Okay, that produces a living thing. And living things come from the ground. Okay, plants, they grow. They don't know anything, again, beyond that level. What sustains life? Here's another way to look at where we get everything. What things must you have to have life? Well, semen, because that goes with the copulation idea, that produces life somehow. They're not geneticists, but they know that that produces life. And blood is important because, hey, like out in the battlefield, if you get cut and you just bleed a lot, you're going to die. So, ergo, you must need that red stuff to stay alive. And we all have that red stuff in us, so that must really be important. That must carry life. They also could know that I can't just go out in the water and like breathe it, because then I'm going to drown. Okay, so air must be important. And, naturally you have to have water. You have to drink it a certain amount to stay alive. So that, again, there's these very natural ideas that come from the world they live in. Again, but all those things were made from things that were prior. And so they're trying to explain this. This is why when you read ancient creation accounts across the board, and in this instance, the Israelite material is somewhat exceptional. It's very exceptional. When you read ancient creation accounts, this is why the gods have sex with each other in creation stories. This is why humans are created with blood, or humans are grown from the ground, or they're built out of something. Because to the pre-scientific mind, that's where you get stuff. That's how you make living things. That's how you make anything. That's the language of their experience. Okay, it's not that they're trying to be crude and produce something that would be offensive or titillating. That's where things come from. It's just our experience. So let's get into a couple. In Mesopotamia, you have in their conception, at the beginning, there was just water. All right? And the water itself, this watery, it's just water, the watery abyss it's often referred to, has two sides. It has a male and a female. Again, they're thinking everything came from this watery place, but to produce things, you have to have a male and a female. And so we'll name part of the watery place, we'll give it one name that's the male, and the other part of the watery place is a female, and they're going to get together and multiply. Again, the language of experience. So in this version, we have two natural forces come together and produce two more. So we have the two watery male and female. We have the mud and the sister version. They get together and they produce two more, heaven and earth, the whole heaven and the whole earth. The result of all this divine cohabitation, and it's spoken of in sexual terms in the texts, is that we have all the elements, the primary elements that we need, all existing together. They had to start with an original pair, but the heavens and earth that we experience as Mesopotamians was not made yet. That's still coming. Here's what happens next. This is the Sumerian version. So you have your primeval deities, your elements, existing in this watery abyss, and they get busy. The male side and the female side get together and they produce An, which is the Sumerian word for heaven. This is the heaven that humans see, that they experience. They get together again and they produce earth. Now I have them labeled as husband and brother or wife and sister because they're going to marry each other to produce more things. And what they produce is the Sumerian pantheon. All the deities that are going to do nasty things to humans and do nice things to humans and fight with each other, they're produced from these other deities. Now, one of these other deities, the leader, his name is Enlil. And eventually in the story, he's going to displace On, the heaven. He wants to rule the heavens. He has a brother named Enki, who's important in another version. This one over here. This is the Babylonian version. Now, in terms of chronology, Sumeria, just call it 3000, 2500 BC. Babylonian version is like 1500 years later. Okay, but they're going to have their own version. We have Apsu, again, the male side of the watery abyss. He's disturbed by the other primeval element gods in there. He doesn't like them. And so he plans to destroy them. The plot is discovered by one of these other deities, Anki, and he says, I can't let that happen because the gods are okay. You know, without them, we wouldn't be here. It's just not fair. So he gets rid of Apsu. He stops the plot. And eventually, he's going to have a son named Marduk, because the gods are always having babies, okay? Marduk is the head of the pantheon in Babylon. He is viewed as the creator of the heaven and earth that the people experience. And in this version, his female counterpart is a goddess called Tiamat. She is always pictured as a dragon or some kind of water beast. Okay? They don't get along. They have a fight, and Marduk kills Tiamat. Now, the interesting thing is what he does with her body, because he still wants to make heaven and earth. So he splits her body in two pieces, and one part he makes into heaven, and the other part he makes into earth. So the story is that of a single deity, Marduk, killing some weird sort of dragon beast, and out of her body making heaven and earth, and then everything's wonderful. Everything's orderly. Okay, the forces of evil have been subdued and destroyed. So that's the Babylonian version. Now you recall from our talk last week that we said Genesis can be read in such a way that you have pre-existing material that God returns to or gets around to ordering, and that can be the way we understand Genesis. And if you remember from last week, the first creative act then would be in verse 3. So you could have the same sort of feel that in the Mesopotamian version, Marduk takes material, it's the body of Tiamat, he splits it, he severs it, he separates it. Keep the word separation in your mind. And out of the separation comes heaven and earth. And so he's using material that is available to him, and he brings about heaven and earth. So there's a loose conceptual parallel there. The problem is, how does this really relate to Genesis 1 through 3, other than the big concept? Because you look at it, where's the dragon? I'll give you a second to read it. Can you find the dragon? Anybody who can find this dragon ought to win some kind of geek award, because you've been reading all the stuff that I typically read. Where's the dragon? Yes. Well, yeah, that's cheating. Is the dragon there or not? You say, well, how is the deep the dragon? Because the word deep in Hebrew is tehom, which is the Hebrew equivalent to Tiamat. Now, when Mesopotamian stuff was first deciphered in the late 19th century, Hebrew scholars, Semitic scholars who finally cracked cuneiform to translate it, they came across Tiamat in certain texts, creation texts, splitting the body. And they thought of the Genesis story because of the word and because God separates this from that. And, they're thinking, oh, there must be some relationship here. And here we have this word. That's kind of weird, And then you'd read further on in the flood story. Well, there was a flood story. There are several flood stories from Babylon. And people their imagination really started to run wild with this, where you were literally seeing a Babylonian piece of mythology behind Genesis everywhere. It was an overreaction. It became known as pan-Babylonianism, because we just see Babylonian stuff everywhere in Genesis. But there was this link, okay? So they knew something was going on. Nowadays, people have backed away from this. Even the most rank liberal scholar would not say that Genesis comes from Mesopotamian material. That says too much, because there really is no battle. Yeah, we might have Tiamat there, but there's no battle. Tehom, everywhere else it occurs in the Hebrew Bible, is never used as though it was a person. It's never, in any kind of, creating anything context. There are other Old Testament creation accounts that do have God slaying a dragon. We're going to get to those tonight. But the word Tehom is never in them. Okay. And so they thought this was a wrong-headed idea. Something's going on here, but it's not this Mesopotamian stuff. It's sort of, it looks like it's there, but it's really not that good. This is more or less my observation on it. If you look at Tehom, now let's just do a little theology here. Let's say that Tehom does represent the forces of chaos. Everywhere else not everywhere else, but many, many places in the Old Testament, you get this idea of the raging sea as being synonymous with disorder and chaos. What if that is what's going on in Genesis? Well, Genesis has it already subdued. The forces of chaos are already subdued. You get this feel that the water's still and the Spirit of God's hovering over the water. And God says, let's get to work. God orders everything. He gets to the end and says, it's all good. It's all very good. But chaos is still there. In other words, God doesn't eliminate it. It's just under control. I don't want to rabbit trail on that too much, but we always wonder why is there evil? Why is there unpredictability in the world? And an Israelite would say, it's because God subdued it, controls it, and lets it exist. It is part of the creation. It's what he wanted, and he sustains it and controls it. Now, if he would remove his hand from it, which some prophecies say he's going to do at some point, then we have problems. So Genesis presents a world that has unpredictability built into it, but God is in control of it. But there is no mythological battle. There is in earlier creation stories stuff that comes prior to this Babylonian feel. And I'm going to skip through a lot of this real quickly. In the 1920s, late 1920s, 1930s, there was a place known as Ugarit. It's in ancient Syria. It was an old city-state. It was destroyed around 1200 BC. And that's really secure because there are literally tablets that come from Ugarit that were taken out of the ovens by archaeologists that say, the enemy's coming to get us, we're all going to die. I mean, they're still in the oven. So it's pretty secure that, we kind of know when they were destroyed. It's kind of like Pompeii in that respect. Just you got like a snapshot in time. Some of this stuff deals with a lot of this creation language. The people at Ugarit, ancient Syria, which if you remember your biblical geography, if you've got Israel, as sort of the perpendicular country that it is, and down here is the Dead Sea, and a little ways up here is Sea of Galilee, and then up here you've got Syria. Okay, Syria is right next door to the northern kingdom of Israel. Syria, Ugarit, was the hub for Baal worship. It's one of the reasons why the prophets just went crazy all the time with Baal, because they lived next door, and it was the ideas were seeping over into Israelite religion. Plus, if you know your biblical history, once Solomon dies and the kingdom splits, what does Jeroboam do? What's one of the first things he does? His people say, well, this was really a great idea, Jeroboam. Okay, we didn't want taxes, and we've seceded from the union now, and there's 10 tribes here, and we're doing our own thing, but you left out one detail, the temples in the other territory. So what do we do? We're supposed to go down there a few times a year to worship, and we've got all these festivals. Did you overlook that? And so Jeroboam's answer is, yeah, I kind of did overlook that. His solution is, well, we'll just have our own temple up here. we'll just make our own centers of worship, because he didn't want people going down to the south because they might defect. He might lose them. And they start their own system of worship. And it's filled with Baalism, because those are their neighbors. This is where Elijah has the famous confrontation. Choose you today which God you're going to serve. That happens in the north at Carmel. So you've got this context going on, and the literature from this part of the ancient world has several key deities. Baal is the one we all know and don't love. There's another one named Yam, which is the word for sea. Nahar is river. There's Tanun, which is a dragon. Litanu, which is also a sea dragon. In Ugaritic thinking, their creation thinking, again, the sea, Yam, was the force of chaos and had to be defeated. And so in their stories, Baal does all that. Baal destroys the dragon. Baal's the great, God, the sustainer of everything. He supposedly dies and then comes back from the dead, and but there's a big debate over that. But he's the guy. In the Hebrew Bible, you will find a number of places where Yahweh, the God of Israel, is described in Baal terminology. Why do they do that? Because the biblical writer wants it to be clear to his readers that, no, it isn't Baal who did this or that great thing. It isn't some other, god that the foreigners worship. El was their other big deity. It's Yahweh. And so the writers are very familiar with their literature, and they'll take phrases and episodes and vocabulary out of the pagan literature, import it into what they're writing in the Hebrew Bible, and literally change the names. And they will give the God of Israel credit. It's a theological technique. It's a polemic. We use the word polemic. If we could pretend to ourselves, if we didn't have a Bible, try to pretend we don't have a Bible, and we're sitting here and we don't like the powers that be, the authority figures, whether they be religious or political, and somehow we're sure that God is leading us to produce our own record, our own theological correction of what we should believe. One of the things we might do is we might hear a claim of some other deity or some authority figure taking credit for something. I'm responsible for, the crops that grow. And if people were familiar with that, we could say, okay, I'm going to take a shot at that. While I'm writing my history of who the true God really is, I'm going to take that claim, bring it in here, and I'm going to set the record straight. Biblical writers did that all the time. It's a slap in the face of whoever gets displaced in the text. Now, I mention all that to bring us to Psalm 74. Look at this psalm. God is my king. My king is from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided, you separated the sea. The Hebrew word is also yam, just like it is in Ugaritic. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters. The Hebrew word is tanin. It's the word for dragons. The sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. Leviathan is the Hebrew spelling of litanu, which is what comes out of the Ugaritic material. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You split open springs and brooks. You dried up the ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night. You have established the heavenly lights and the sun. When did that happen? At creation. You have fixed all the boundaries of the earth. Yep. You've made summer and winter. All those things happen at creation. The earth is formed. The seas are gathered into one place and are still. The boundaries of habitation are fixed. The seasons go into effect with the sun, moon, and stars. They're light holders. And Genesis 1 tells you they're, for seasons and times and all this sort of stuff. This is a creation text, but it doesn't sound anything like, in some places, like Genesis 1. But it's communicating the same idea. Who brought everything into existence? Who brought order out of chaos? Who defeats chaos? Who defeats the forces of the natural elements that, if left alone, they're just going to go nuts? Who does that? Is it Baal? No. It's yet God my King from of old. It's the God of Israel. This is a classic example of a creation text that looks on the surface different than Genesis 1, but is saying the same thing. It's got nothing to do with science unless you believe that scientific origins involve slaying a dragon. Okay, there are no mythological dragons. Okay, that isn't how the world came to be. A dragon dies somewhere in the sea. Okay, we know this. But to them, you have to realize that these characters in the story represent deities that are either good or evil. And they fight. There's combat. And the Mesopotamians say 1-1, Marduk won. And he thank goodness he won, because we have an orderly world now that we can experience and live in. The people of Ugarit would say, no, it's not Marduk. He's a flunky. It was Baal. Baal's the one that came out on top. He's the one that brings order out of chaos. And the Egyptians, it's somebody else. Depending on what city you lived in, it could be 3 or 4 different gods in Egypt. But for the Israelite, when the Israelite writes what we have in our Old Testament, in our creation accounts, he's not thinking, okay, how am I going to present a scientific account of how everything came to be? When I don't know science, nobody who's going to read it will know scientific language, but in the future they will. Isn't the point? His job, again, in the context of inspiration, his job is, we cannot let this bad theology go unaddressed. Okay? It's theological messaging. Now, I have an arrow here for the wilderness, pointing at the wilderness. Does that sound incongruous? Well, if it's the sea, how do you get the wilderness in the sea? Anybody notice that? The wilderness thing? It's because, let me just ask in the form of a question. Was there anything else that had to do with water that God acted upon that was perceived as an act of creation that wasn't the original creation? God, water, what was that? Come on. He said, what other place does water get split? The Red Sea. You will find other passages where this creation language is brought up in the description of the deliverance from Egypt. Because in the Israelite mind, that was just as dramatic. That was just as epic as creation. Because the gods of Egypt were defeated at the sea. Pharaoh is a god. Okay, is he not? They get through, and what does Miriam do? She sings, "O Yahweh, who among you is like the gods?" You have this long song, when you get through Exodus, the crossing. God defeats the forces of chaos again by delivering Israel from Egypt and destroying their gods, by showing, I'm the one that controls the fate of mankind, not these idiots in Egypt. Okay? These passages are just, pregnant with theology. I mean, they're to use the watery metaphor, they're spilling over with these little touch points. Why is it that up until Exodus, the God of Israel is not known as Yahweh? He's known as the God of the fathers. El Shaddai, El this, El that. Okay, God reveals his name at Sinai and says, I'm the God of your fathers. Yeah, that's me. But my name is I am. Which in Hebrew, when the first person speaker is speaking, is yeah. When you refer to that person, the pronunciation is Yahweh. And Yahweh, you know what it means? He who causes to be. It's from Hayah, the to be verb. Well, why would he say my name is the one who causes things to be? Because we got some creative work here that needs to be done. You used to be a nation and you went down to Egypt and you've been there for 400 years and now I'm going to act. It's going to be like an act of new creation. I'm creating something that really doesn't exist anymore, and I'm going to bring it to be. I'm going to bring what is not to be. That's why you get the name. Again, all these ideas are connected. If we look at Psalm 89, see if my link will work here.